Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome. I hope everyone can hear me. I think we're good. All right, great. I'm going to give just a couple more minutes for some more folks to join, maybe just another minute, see if anybody else tunes in. Let's go ahead and test out the chat box while we're waiting for a few more folks to join. If you'll look to, I think it should be on the right of your screen, there should be a chat box there. So could everyone please let me know through the chat box, give me your job title and where you work. I would really like to know who we have tuned in today. I'd love to know who I'm talking to. So go ahead and type in the chat box, like I said, your title, your job title, and where you work. Waiting for those responses to come in. This is also a good time to let me know if you're having any issues at all. You should be able to see my PowerPoint on your screen. So go ahead and type in the chat box if you're having any problems. We can work those things out before we jump into the training. All right, we've got folks from Chat, Avalon, awesome. Thank you for being here. Scott County Shelter, 3 of you watching from there, great. Shelby County Pretrial Services. These are all coming through to my questions instead of the chat box, so that's probably why I imagine the rest of you probably can't see these answers coming in. So I apologize for that. I don't know why that's happening, but I can at least see your responses. Hi, Chloe from CEAS. Chloe works on the project that I coordinate here, so happy to see her. More folks from Avalon, Family Violence Program. Great. We have some really good participation this morning. I'm excited. And from all over. Other folks from Memphis at the Hope Center. Great. Okay, awesome. Well, it's 10:03 now, so we probably have everybody here that's going to be tuning in. Thank you all so much for being here. I know that your days are busy. This is the middle of the week. You probably have a lot of other things you could be doing, so I appreciate you taking the time to tune in and appreciate the fact that you wanted to spend your morning this way. I'll go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Megan Batista. I'm a program specialist here at the Tennessee Coalition to End Domestic and Sexual Violence. And I'm having some trouble with my screen. Give me just 1 second. There we go. There's my information. So I've been here at the Coalition for 2.5 years, and I work on the Coalition's Rural Sexual Assault Project. This is a project funded by the Office on Violence Against Women. And the focus of the Rural Project is to enhance and improve direct services for male and LGBTQ sexual assault survivors all across rural Tennessee. So this webinar is funded by the Rural Project, and our main focus today is on male sexual assault survivors, of course, but you're also going to see that there's a lot of overlap between the male survivor experience and LGBTQ issues. So we're going to talk about that, and we're going to look at the intersection of social constructs of masculinity and heterosexism, and how anti-gay prejudice is really harmful to male survivors as well. That's all men, straight men, cisgender men too. So we're going to talk about that a lot more, and I'm excited to do that today. I also want to insert just a brief trigger warning here. Please take care of yourselves. Know that we're going to be talking about some difficult things, sometimes explicitly, and you're encouraged to take a break. Put my voice on mute for a moment if you need to. Step away from your computer. Do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. So let's define male. What do I mean when I say male? Well, I mean gay men, straight men, transgender men, cisgender men, men in same-sex relationships, men in heterosexual relationships. Gender identity exists on a spectrum, and that spectrum is wide. So when I say male today, I mean all male identified persons. And why do we need a webinar on male sexual assault survivors specifically? What is the point of this training? Well, every survivor's experience is unique, and whether male or female, straight or gay, transgender, non-binary, what have you, the way folks experience and recover from sexual abuse varies from one individual to the next based on many factors outside of gender. While the experience of individuals does vary from one person to the next, we also know too that survivors as a whole can share so many of the same trauma responses and have many of the same needs following sexual abuse. I think service providers can still sometimes perceive male survivors as sort of being in this category of their own. We can sometimes be intimidated at the idea of broadening our services to reach men. I think a lot of us have this feeling that we have to have some sort of highly specialized and unique training in order to be able to serve male survivors. I hope that's not why you tuned into this training today, because one, that's not what I'm going to be able to give you, and two, I don't think we need highly specialized, unique training in order to be able to serve men. Like I said, no matter your gender, we're all human, and sexual violence and abuse is equally impactful and traumatizing regardless of gender. However, what we are here for today, what we are going to talk about, is that there are some factors that make the male experience unique. That's why we're having this webinar. So understanding these unique aspects are important if we're going to provide trauma-informed services for men, and if we're going to continue to bring male survivors their stories into light and into this movement. So the uniqueness for men, the difference for men, really lies in these three factors. I'm going to cover each of these three factors one at a time. So we're going to talk about the invisibility of male survivors, gender stereotypes related to masculinity, and heterosexism. So the first one is the invisibility of male survivors. Male stories have not historically been included in this conversation or movement. The conversation being that of sexual violence, and the movement being the violence against women movement. And you can hear it right there in the name. This implies that the violence is exclusively committed against women, and survivors of another gender do not exist. Now, of course, we know women are victims of violence at much higher rates than men, whether that violence is domestic abuse, rape, sexual assault. Women are more often victimized. But men do experience these victimizations too. And excluding their stories from the conversation, it isolates them, it makes it much harder for them to seek and receive services, and greatly impacts their recovery process. I think that the language we use really matters. So I encourage all of us to shift towards using the term gender-based violence instead of violence against women. It's important that we open up this conversation to be inclusive of all survivors. Because male survivors' stories have not historically been included in this conversation, we are now in a place where there exists a real lack of services for male survivors. Or even when services do exist, there is a legitimate perceived lack of services. So I do believe that the landscape for male survivors is changing, however. In recent years, we've seen some big culture shifts and policy changes that have brought male survivors into the conversation and into the movement. Most notably, the 2013 reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act added a condition prohibiting discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. So since the 2013 VAWA reauthorization, I believe we've seen major advancements in our work for male survivors specifically, because now, besides it being the right and ethical thing to do, providing services is also required by law for those of us receiving certain federal funding. Prior to this reauthorization, many programs were still turning men away and refusing services for male survivors. I personally am not seeing this happen anymore in Tennessee. On the contrary, I see our Tennessee programs taking advanced steps in their services for male survivors. I see more male survivors speaking publicly about their survivorship, so I think we are definitely on the road to improvement, but our history of silencing and denying male sexual violence still remains. We can't erase that history, and that's greatly impacted and will continue to impact the way male survivors process and recover from abuse. So that's the first factor. The second factor that makes the male survivor experience unique is gender stereotypes. That is, what society as a whole tells us about what it means to be male, what it means to be a man. I would really love to have all of you start this part of our conversation for me. So using the chat box again, please type in your answers to this question. What does it mean to be a man? What does society tell us as a whole that defines a man? And please type in as many answers as you'd like. You don't have to type in just one. And I'll wait to receive some of those. So yeah, when you hear the phrase, be a man, what does that mean? Strong, macho, absolutely. And I see someone earlier, Juanita, you asked if you'll receive a copy of the PowerPoint. Yes, absolutely. I'll be sending that out after the close of the webinar. Thank you. Yes, men are expected to be strong, dominant, a provider, no emotions or muted emotions, absolutely. A leader. Men aren't supposed to have weakness. They're powerful, absolutely. Responsible, in control. Great, these are all really good answers. So yeah, we expect men to take initiative, to be competitive, to be dominant. These are all stereotypical roles that define men within a culture, and we call these masculinity ideologies. Masculinity ideologies are that men are invulnerable, men are conquerors, men are often thought of as supposed to being like heavy drinkers or be able to hold their alcohol. Like many of you said, men don't show emotion, a real man doesn't ask for help. And these expectations, even small boys are held to them. When boys get hurt, we tell them to suck it up, don't cry. We say things like, take it like a man up, grow some balls. I know every single one of us have heard these things said before. And this language sends a very clear message to boys and men about how they must act in order to be perceived as a man. Gender stereotypes tell men that they're not supposed to be hurt. They can't experience pain or victimization. And if they do, they certainly can't ask for help or show their emotion. All male environments, especially, these are places like fraternities, men's sports teams, the military. These places cultivate the tendency for violence perpetrated by men against women and by men against other men. So these all-male spaces, they encourage a sense of competition, violence as a rite of passage. These spaces tend to encourage violence as an expression of dominant status or of power. So men are likely to be victimized, like I said, by other men within these spaces especially. Now, how might these masculinity ideologies, how might those things affect a man who has been sexually assaulted? I would love to hear some more responses to that. And we have one person who says they've lost audio. Oh, it's back. Okay, great. Good. Thank you for that, Angela. So yeah, please type in the chat box, how do these masculinity ideologies, these ideas that you all shared of what it means to be a man, how might those things affect a man who's been sexually assaulted? Thank you, Misty. Yes, it makes them question their sexuality, absolutely. Lessens the likelihood of reporting sexual assaults, yes, because of the stigma attached to it. Makes them feel like they are less of a man, exactly, because this isn't supposed to happen to a real man, right? So it brings up feelings of shame, questions of manhood, self-blame, disbelief, because again, men aren't supposed to be hurt or victimized. Makes them feel they've lost control in their identity, diminishes their ego, restricts them from expressing their true emotions and feelings, and it demeans their manhood. Absolutely. These are all really fantastic answers. Makes them feel powerless. Yeah, so we see that gender stereotypes, these ideas that we all have about what it means to be a man, greatly affect men who have been sexually assaulted. So that's the second factor that makes the male experience particularly unique. Let's move on to the third and final factor. So we've talked about how the male survivor's experience is unique because of gender stereotypes and the invisibility of male survivors. Now, I also said earlier that the male survivor's experience is different because of anti-gay prejudice or heterosexism. Just a quick side note on language before we get into the reasons for this. I think most of us are more used to the term homophobia than we are to the terms anti-gay prejudice or heterosexism. I personally prefer to use the terms anti-gay prejudice or heterosexism as opposed to homophobia. I try to avoid using homophobia more and more because it's a clinical term. Phobias are anxiety disorders, and I don't think that describes what we're talking about when we use the word homophobia. What we mean is discrimination or hate or prejudice against LGBTQ folks. So I just want to make sure it's understood. That is why I'm using the terms anti-gay prejudice or heterosexism. I understand that most of us are used to homophobia, so I want to make that clear. Yeah, that's my little tangent there. So what does anti-gay prejudice or heterosexism have to do with male sexual assault? Well, 96 to 98% of perpetrators, no matter the gender of the victim, are heterosexual men. So the vast majority of male survivors' perpetrators are going to be men. And this causes, like many of you pointed out, male survivors, they'll have questions about their sexuality. Questions like, did I do something to invite this assault? Will people think that I'm gay when I tell them this happened to me? And perpetrators, they tell their male victims, you wanted this. This is your fault. Corrective rape is a term that describes when someone is raped because of their perceived sexual orientation. Corrective rape is a brutal hate crime perpetrated in order to, quote unquote, fix the victim's sexuality. Often when men do disclose, especially if they disclose publicly, they're met with hateful anti-LGBTQ rhetoric, like, this happened to you because you're gay. Because we live in a predominantly anti-gay society, there's a lot of shame and embarrassment packed into this for male survivors. And these anti-LGBTQ fears and questions that men have after sexual assault and the anti-LGBTQ rhetoric they're met with after they disclose, it can all make them so far less likely to disclose what happened to them. And this is why raising awareness about the widespread prevalence of male sexual assault and the real reasons that perpetrators do commit assault and abuse is so important. So let's talk about that next. How prevalent is male sexual violence? Let's look at some of these key statistics. So 1 in 6 males will be sexually assaulted in their lifetime. Most researchers agree that it's actually even more than 1 in 6, considering the stigma around reporting for men. Men don't report for all of the same reasons that women don't, in addition to reasons that are unique to men, like the social stigma, the idea that men can't be victims, or that a man who is a victim isn't truly a man, right? All of these things that we've already discussed. And the reason, like we said, the fear of being judged as gay is another reason that men don't report. Men sexually abused in childhood typically disclose on average 22 years after the assault. And this is 10 years later than the average time it takes women to disclose childhood sexual abuse. So women, of course, they face stigma around reporting too. They also experience extreme shame and embarrassment and self-blame, all of which keeps women from reporting. But This statistic, I think, indicates that all of those things can keep men silent longer than women. The Pentagon estimates that 38 military men are sexually assaulted every single day. And military culture in particular, it's the best way I've heard it described is that it's built on a balance of aggression and obedience. So the potential for sexual violence is certainly going to exist whenever there is too much of either aggression or obedience. Stop Prison Rape, the organization estimates that 360,000 men are sexually assaulted or raped in prisons in the United States every year. For the majority of these inmates, these are not isolated one-time incidents, but rather they're repeated occurrences happening on a daily basis. Just Detention International, the organization, they say that contrary to popular belief, most perpetrators in prisons are not inmates, but rather corrections officials whose job it is to keep inmates safe. And it's also important to note that survivors in custody, they often face severe consequences if they report, including being placed in isolation. They experience repeated attacks if they report. They're considered weak and an easy target for repeated attacks. A 2005 study conducted by the U.S. Centers for Disease Control reported that 16% of males are sexually abused by the age of 18. 26% of sexual assault victims under the age of 12 are boys. And only 16% of men with documented histories of sexual abuse. These are documented histories by social service agencies, which means it was very serious. Only 16% of those considered themselves to have been sexually abused, compared to 64% of women with documented histories in the same study. So men, they have a much more difficult time even identifying the fact that they have been abused, identifying that what happened to them was sexual abuse or sexual assault, because they're socially conditioned to believe that only women can be victims. So just like victims of any gender, male-identified survivors experience PTSD, depression, flashbacks, anxiety, anger, issues that are more common or more acute for male survivors are things like questions about their sexuality, questions about their masculinity, again, feelings of isolation. Men are more likely to abuse alcohol and drugs as a coping mechanism and a way for them to disassociate from reality. Let's talk about some common myths. There are many myths surrounding male sexual assault. Many of these are rooted in anti-gay prejudice. One of the most common myths is that male perpetrators of male victims identify as gay. By and large, this is not the case. I think I mentioned this statistic earlier, that heterosexual men commit 96 to 98% of all sexual violence against males and females. It's not about sex. Sexual assault is not about sexual desire. It's about power and control. It's about exercising power and inflicting humiliation on somebody else. Another common myth is that boys abused by males must have attracted the abuse because they are gay. But again, sexual abuse is not about sexual attraction. It's about power and control. It's an act of violence. Though gay and bisexual men and trans men, they are targeted more often because of their sexual identity, because of anti-LGBTQ feelings in society. Sexual assault can be and is used as a method of hate violence against LGBTQ persons. However, no victim could do anything to invite or ask for violence committed against them. We should be very clear about that. Another myth is that boys will become gay as a result of the abuse. This myth is also rooted, like these others, in anti-LGBTQ culture. And At best, if I really want to give folks who believe this, perpetuate this myth, if I really want to give those folks the benefit of the doubt, I could say that it's the result of sorely misinterpreted research. There is substantial research that shows LGBTQ persons are more likely than heterosexual cisgender persons to experience sexual violence. But again, this is because sexual assault can be a part of bias-motivated violence against LGBTQ folks, such as corrective rape, like we talked about. It is not because sexual abuse causes someone to turn gay. Experts in human sexuality agree that sexual orientation is far more complex than that. No one can turn another person gay. So, like I said, at best, this myth is a misinterpretation of research, but at worst, it's extremely anti-LGBTQ. And I do hear this myth most often from anti-LGBTQ groups who are looking for data to show that something had to have gone wrong for someone to be gay. They point to this and say, well, here's the reason that someone turns gay. It's because something terrible happened to them. So it's just an extremely harmful myth to LGBTQ persons, men or women or non-binary. Another common myth is that if a man or boy is sexually abused by a woman, he was lucky, and there's something wrong with him if he doesn't agree. Some of you may remember the Florida middle school teacher who sexually abused her 14-year-old male student. This happened in the early 2000s. And the late night show host, Jay Leno, he infamously joked about the abuse, saying, where were these teachers when I was in school? And this is the sort of response we often see from the public when a female teacher is caught sexually exploiting a male student. We act like the boy was lucky to get some action, quote unquote, when in reality, boys who are sexually exploited or abused by older women, they're harmed and they are traumatized by the abuse as any other victim of this crime. Another myth, somewhat in the same vein, is that arousal equals consent. This myth causes so much self-blame for male victims. It's so harmful. And it's another myth that can keep men from reporting or disclosing their abuse. So we need to be very clear and explicit about this. Ejaculation or erection does not equal consent ever. It does not mean that the encounter was wanted. These are natural bodily responses that can be forced or manipulated and occur out of the control of the victim. The presence of any sort of arousal does not ever equal consent. The last myth we'll cover here, and one that is especially harmful to male survivors, is that boys who are sexually abused will become perpetrators themselves. And this is not true. There is research to show that some perpetrators, certainly not all, but some perpetrators were abused as boys and young men. One trusted study says that it's up to 80%. Another trusted study says that it's as low as 30% of perpetrators that were abused as boys. But it is not true that many victims will become perpetrators. The fact that some perpetrators were abused in their past is misinterpreted to mean that survivors will become perpetrators. And this is a dangerous myth for victims because it can cause them to become fearful that they may become perpetrators, and victims can be, it can cause them to become fearful that they'll be a danger to others, or they'll be perceived as a danger to others if they come forward about their victimization. So I really appreciate this quote, which essentially says that most of us, after experiencing a terrible event, become fierce advocates to never let that terrible thing ever happen to anyone else. And that is true for male survivors as well. Okay, now all of this information we've already covered contributes to our ability to provide trauma-informed services to male survivors. But let's talk about a few practical tips you can implement in your service provision for men specifically. That first tip is to check your bias. This is a challenge, and it's okay to acknowledge that this is challenging, because the reality is that every one of us has implicit biases. It's part of our humanity. If I tell myself that I don't have any bias, that I think of all people and survivors the same regardless of gender, then I'm doing myself a disservice and I'm doing survivors a disservice. What we can do about that is openly acknowledge the fact, actively seek out information to challenge our bias, and be critical of our own actions and assumptions in light of our known biases. So we should be asking ourselves, how might our implicit bias cause us to react when we, say, pick up a hotline call and hear a male voice on the other end? If that man is a survivor seeking help, is he going to hear caution or mistrust in my voice? It's imperative that we remember to guard against any bias we may have against males due to the nature of our work, because what we know and what we see in this work is that proportionately women experience sexual violence at much higher rates than men. Research tells us this, our own experiences as advocates tells us that this is true. And the fact that the vast majority of perpetrators are men, I think really impacts our bias as well. But again, let's not misinterpret the fact that most men are perpetrators to mean that all men are perpetrators. In fact, the vast majority of men are not. So that's a good reminder when we start to feel bias towards men creep in, because all survivors deserve to be believed. All survivors deserve compassionate care. Another tip is to reimagine your counseling. Traditional counseling can be a challenge for men whose idea of masculinity has taught them that receiving help in that way, receiving counseling, is a sign of weakness. There are other ways to counsel men by meeting them in spaces that feel less formal, that feel more like an open playing field between the counselor and the counseled. So things like talking over a game of basketball, through gardening, whatever interests your client may have, over a cup of coffee, or by cooking together, by hiking. Structuring counseling sessions around an activity can put the survivor at ease and make them a little more open to sharing, which can sometimes be more of a struggle for men. And this can, of course, be true for survivors of any gender, but I think it is helpful. It's an especially helpful tip for men specifically. All right, another tip is, gender-integrated support groups and shelters. Groups for males are extremely rare, and this reinforces a sense of isolation, and it further promotes the invisibility of male experiences of victimization. The organization Forge Forward, you'll hear me reference them a lot because I think they're just fantastic. They have really great resources. They have a fantastic webinar and a publication on gender-integrated sexual assault support groups and shelters, and I'm going to send you all the link to that so you can hear more about this, because I think it's a difficult topic for some. But I want to highlight just a point or two from their training here. So one of the most common assumptions about gender-integrated groups and gender-integrated shelters is that women will feel unsafe being in group therapy or in shelter with men. But what I hear most often from service providers who have integrated their services is that this assumption rarely becomes reality. Most women who are abused, they don't want to be in the same room as their abuser, of course, but if it's another man, especially a male survivor, they have no problem. And again, the extreme majority of men are not perpetrators, but are rather appalled by sexual abuse just like the rest of us. For those female victims whose perpetrators were male and may have some related trauma and fear around men, it can be highly beneficial for them to see that most men are not dangerous. Having gender-integrated support groups and shelters can also minimize costs if we're looking at it from a very practical standpoint, which nonprofits do have to do. And it can be more considerate of transgender survivors and non-binary survivors, which is really important. Programs should consider how segregated services will affect transgender or non-binary survivors. For the rapidly growing segment of the population that identifies as gender nonconforming or non-binary, they may feel an additional burden or stress if they're asked to choose between binary options of male or female, neither of which may correspond with the gender identity that they identify with. Programs should also consider how segregated services such as placing a male survivor in a hotel instead of shelter, or not offering group support for men, how those things could reinforce a sense of isolation that male survivors are already going to be feeling. And we should go back to the VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act 2013 reauthorization here. If you receive federal funding, you are required by law to provide comparable services and not discriminate based on gender identity or sexual orientation. The Violence Against Women condition provides that a recipient may offer sex-segregated or sex-specific programming when it is necessary to the essential operation of a program. But you have to prove that it's essential to the necessary operation. If a program decides that segregating a service such as shelter is necessary, it must be able to offer equitable services to clients of all genders. And now, if you have the capability, if you have the money, the resources, and the manpower to offer options to your program participants, if you can offer both gender-specific and all-gender support groups, then that's great. It's perfectly fine to offer everyone options. You could also consider shorter-term support groups if you're having a hard time putting a group together just because there's simply not enough interest, which is often an issue with male participants. And one last small tip on this, if you are conducting all-male support groups, some facilitators do prefer to use the label men's group instead of men's survivor group or male victims group. And this is because men tend to identify with the terms survivor and victim a lot less than women do. So just simply dropping the words victim and survivor in your titles can really help you recruit more male participants. All right, we've come to the final section of this training. The last thing I want to talk about is outreach and community partnerships. How can programs target their outreach efforts to male survivors specifically? Conducting outreach within and building partnerships with all male or predominantly male service agencies is perhaps the best way and probably the most obvious way of getting your information in front of male survivors. So groups like Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous are great places to start. Foster group homes, prison reentry programs, veterans assistance programs, drug courts, fraternities. These are all predominantly male places in which it can be really great to advertise your services. And having strong relationships with these other service organizations has two benefits. Not only will it increase the number of survivors who will know about your services, that's one benefit, it will also build your referral list. It will equip your agency to make more trauma-informed referrals for your clients. Because when we're making referrals, especially for underserved populations, like male sexual assault victims, it's really important that we know which other agencies in our community are going to be well equipped to serve those survivors. I understand it can be difficult. I hear this a lot from advocates. It's difficult to take that first step in building a relationship with community partners. When you're connecting with other agencies, my recommendation is that you consider what other issues these agencies or your community as a whole is already looking at. What are the other issues they're already trying to address? And then connect sexual assault to that issue. There's always overlap. Your community may be facing issues like addiction, poverty, homelessness. Understand how sexual assault is related and is influenced by these other issues, and build your partnership on coming together and tackling both sexual violence and whatever that other problem is jointly. For example, this can be an especially helpful tactic to use in places like schools where it can be kind of hard to get your foot in the door. Start by offering up your training services on a topic that's really easy for the school board and parents and everyone to get on board with. So something like anti-bullying or online safety, those are going to be concerns already for schools. Then once that relationship with the school has been established, you can propose other slightly more controversial topics, like rape prevention and systemic sexism. So the idea is to connect the issue of sexual assault to an issue that is already important to your partners, and you're going to find that it's suddenly of much greater interest for everyone involved to start building those strong collaborations. Another great tip is to look at your outreach materials. Ask yourself, would a man know just from seeing these things that they could get help from your program? Consider the name of your program, consider your branding, your brochures, your outreach materials, your social media posts are important. Are you only posting about heterosexual relationships? Are you only using language that refers to heterosexual relationships? Are you only using images that show heterosexual relationships? When we don't include male images and male stories and male statistics in our materials and our narrative, we further isolate male survivors and we perpetuate the harmful narrative that sexual assault can't or doesn't happen to men. Also, framing your messaging in a positive light can be so important. So ask yourself, what does your messaging say you can offer to survivors? Are you offering something positive? Offer community and connection for those male survivors who are feeling isolated. Offer an opportunity to end the cycle of violence. That is a major draw for men. Offer knowledge about creating healthy relationships, about creating strong families. Offer empowerment for survivors. Positive messaging is, especially for men, far more compelling and likely to elicit a response. Because remember, men are told they can't be victims. They're less likely to see themselves as a victim. So they're more likely to respond to that positive messaging. Another way you might consider doing outreach is by launching awareness campaigns to shed light on the prevalence of male victimizations. These are just a couple of examples of some really popular campaigns. And I know that smaller programs don't have the same capability as these huge national programs do, but that doesn't mean you can do a campaign like one of these on a smaller scale. And in your campaign, instead of just saying, like you do in your brochures, we are here to serve everyone, use your campaign to tell male survivors that they're not alone in their trauma. Male victims, especially, like I've said, many times already, sometimes men can't even identify that what has happened to them is sexual assault. A campaign that tells men that actually many men, as many as 1 in 6, have experienced sexual assault. This could really increase a man's likelihood of reaching out for help, realizing that they're not alone in this. They're not the only one. One last practical outreach tip. Find someone who already has a face in your community to be a voice for your organization or for your outreach campaign. And this person is going to look different for each unique community. This could be a city council member, a police chief, a librarian, a school principal, a coffee shop owner. Maybe you have a big business in your community, and there's, the big business owner employs a large portion of residents. Just think of somebody who already has a face in your community, somebody that's already well respected and has leverage. Invite them to join you on a radio spot or at community meetings, at school events. If you're utilizing this person for a male outreach campaign specifically, I think a male voice is typically going to be more effective in that situation. But use that influence that an individual in the community already has to leverage your agency services and to gain community buy-in. Finally, it's important that we are prepared to serve the men we broadcast our services to. You've got to be prepared to provide services before you advertise those services. So educate your staff, equip your agency to deliver on the promises you make to male survivors. If you are looking For more information to increase your knowledge or educate your staff, or if you're looking for more supportive resources for male survivors, these are just a few really awesome agencies that I refer to a lot. And I'm going to send you all these slides at the close of this, probably this afternoon, maybe tomorrow morning. But each of these images contains a live link to their corresponding organizations. You can just click on those and go straight to these websites. As we're closing up, I should also remind you to please fill out the surveys that we'll be sending you. And I'm going to ask, when you complete those surveys, I would love to hear what other issues related to male survivors you may want to learn more about. Today's webinar was sort of a broad overview, but we could have gone into much greater detail on some of these things. We, for example, never talked about sexual abuse in IPV and intimate partner violence relationships for male victims, so that's something some of you may want to know more about. Some of you may want to dive deeper into the issue of integrating services, which can really be a big topic for some. So please tell me in your surveys what you're interested in learning more about. I would really love to do some follow-up webinars to this one in the future. And that's the end of this training. Thank you all so much for joining, and thank you for your participation. Most importantly, thank you for the work that you do. Again, the fact that you tuned into this training already tells me a lot about your commitment to all survivors, and I truly appreciate that. All right, my email address is there. Please feel free to email me with any questions. And thanks again. Everyone, enjoy the rest of your day.